Hi everyone. So today's lecture we're going to be learning about energy. And so your learning objectives are to be able to explain how cellular respiration converts food molecules into ATP, a universal source of energy, and the different alternative pathways to energy acquisition and what energy is. So let's get started. So energy flows from the sun and through all life on Earth. So it starts with the sun. And what I need you to know is the first law of thermodynamics, and that is that energy can never be created or destroyed. It can only change from one form to another. And what that means is changing of one form to another means that we have these energy conversions that are happening, right? So all life depends on capturing energy from the sun. So it all starts with the sun, and then converting it into a form that living organisms can use. And so there's two key processes that are happening that are the two forms that living organisms can use. One is photosynthesis, and the other is cellular respiration. So plants do photosynthesis in order to capture that energy. And what we do, and what all the other mammals on the earth do, is cellular respiration. And so when we look here at this, this sort of image that's taking you through the, walking you through the process, we can see that we start with the sun. If you take a look at my cursor here, we start with the sun at the top. This is where all the energy on Earth is kind of starting. And then the plants are capturing those photons of energy through the process of photosynthesis, and they're storing it in the chemical bonds of sugars and other food molecules. And then we and other animals eat the plants, and then we perform cellular respiration. Okay? And so the thing that tends to confuse most people, so I want to make sure that you're not confused at all, is plants can do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And we and other mammals can only do cellular respiration, right? And so organisms, including plants, release the energy stored in the chemical bonds of the food molecules that they eat or the sugar they produce from photosynthesis. And this is what's used as fuel, okay? And then that is energy. That energy that started with the sun ends up being access to us when we actually eat the plants, because the plants converted the energy into sugar and we eat those plants. So nearly all life depends on energy captured from the sun and converted into forms that living organisms can use. So what is energy? Energy is the capacity to do work. So what's work? Work is moving matter against an opposing force. Energy has two forms, and I need you to know this. Energy has what's called potential energy is one form, and then kinetic energy is another form. So two basic forms of energy that I want you to remember. And it's really simple to remember these two. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. If I'm in motion, then I have kinetic energy. So a bird flying, someone on a bicycle, even a raging fire is kinetic energy. Potential energy is the energy of position. So if I have a rocket that is tethered to a platform, that rocket has potential energy. If we have a skier at the top of a mountain, before that skier actually goes down the mountain and goes in motion, that skier standing at the top of the mountain has potential energy. Water behind a dam, before that water actually starts moving past the dam with kinetic energy, it has potential energy as it sits behind the dam. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. Potential energy is the energy of position. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion, but there's two forms that tend to confuse people that actually fall into kinetic energy, and that's heat energy, because remember we said the fire, that's kinetic energy. So heat energy is a form of kinetic energy, and light energy is a form of kinetic energy. We have these photons of light that are moving, and so that's kinetic energy. And so potential energy is this capacity to do work that results from the location or the position of an object. And so these concentration gradients can have potential energy. Food has potential energy. So the bonds also have energy. And they have a special type of energy, the energy that's in foods, and it's called chemical energy. And so here, when we look at our friend glucose, remember good old C6H12O6, we can see that this chemical energy is a form of potential energy, and it's stored in chemical bonds. And the way I like to remember how this form of energy works, this chemical energy works, is, have you guys ever gone camping and you have the glow stick, and you crack the glow stick and then you get the light? Well, that's kind of a good way to think about chemical energy. Whenever I break a bond, energy is released. And I can capture that energy and use it to power my emotions, to power my cellular functions. Okay, break a bond, get energy. So food is a form of chemical energy, and that chemical energy is a form of potential energy. So as energy is captured and converted, the amount of energy available to do work actually decreases. And so let's look at energy conversions. So only less than 1% of the energy released by the sun that the earth receives is captured and converted by plants. And plants are converting it into chemical energy bonds in the form of glucose. But what happens to the other 99% of energy? Well, it turns out that a lot of it is lost to heat, right? So here we're looking at some energy transformations that are happening. And we have here at the bottom left, we have kinetic energy to potential energy, and we've got the light energy of the sun, and we've got the great majority of that energy that's actually transformed into heat, lost to heat, and then less than 1% is going into the chemical energy stored by plants, right? And here we have a person who's running, yay, kinetic energy, right? But here, this person is taking chemical energies, that was made by the plants, and we break it down, and we'll talk later about how we break that down to get to that energy. And we can store it, and we'll talk about how we can store that energy. But a lot of that energy actually gets transformed into heat, and then the remainder, the smaller percentage of that energy, is actually used for motion. And you know this because when you run, you get hot, right? You warm up. And so you may start with, running with a jacket on, but as you're running and you're burning that energy, you're going to heat up because a lot of that energy is lost to heat, and you're going to have to take that jacket off. So we know that this is happening, but now we know why, right? Because of the energy conversion. And so that takes us to the study of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is the study of the transformation of energy from one type to another. So we already talked about the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can never be created or destroyed. It can only change from one form to another. So if I ask you a question on the test that basically says something like, oh, you're going to create this new form of energy, well, energy can never be created. It has to come from a source and then transforms, and we're using this transformation. Or if I ask you on a test, you want to destroy this form of energy, can you destroy it? No, energy can never be destroyed. It can only change from one form to another. Okay. So the second law of thermodynamics is that every energy conversion includes the transformation of some of the energy into heat. So heat is almost completely useless to living organisms. That's why we try to dissipate it, right? Which is why you take your jacket off when you start to get hot, because you want to get rid of the heat. That's why we sweat, so that we can evaporate the water. When it evaporates, it takes some of that extra heat away, so that we stay within a certain temperature within our body. So, second law of thermodynamics, every conversion of energy includes the transformation of some energy into heat. So we always have this loss to heat. So how do cells directly fuel their chemical reactions, right? So none of the light energy from the sun can be used directly to fuel cellular work. So first it's got to be captured. That photon of energy that comes through from the sun, we have to capture that energy, and plants do that, and it has to be captured in the bonds of a molecule called ATP, adenine triphosphate. And remember, we're going to lean to our Greek and our Latin to help us out. Tri means 3, which means that we have an adenosine molecule and 3 phosphates. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP, which I will call it from now on, ATP is sort of this universal molecule of energy that can be used by cells. Okay, so our goal, the goal of all the cells in our body, is to get down to ATP. So when we eat a bowl of salad, we're trying to get to that ATP. When we eat even a steak, or mashed potatoes, anything, we're trying to get to that ATP, and we're going to see how we do that. So ATP molecules are like free-floating rechargeable batteries in all living cells. That's why ATP is so important. So here, this is what ATP looks like in this illustration. We've got adenosine here. We've got ribose, which is a sugar here. And then we've got our 3 phosphates, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Here's the 3 phosphates. And the really cool thing is, every time I break one of these phosphate bonds, just like that glow stick, break a bond, I get energy. So every time I break this bond, I can get energy. And the really cool thing is, I can put another phosphate back on and have it ready to go and ready to give me energy when I need it, just by popping that phosphate back off again. And so basically what cells are doing is they're taking the phosphate off, getting the energy, and then they go through another process, and put the phosphate back on. And that's why it's like a rechargeable battery. So this is just another look at the structure of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? With the 2 high energy bonds that we have between the 3 phosphates that we can tap into in order to get energy. And when we remove one of the phosphates, that takes it down to adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2, right? So when I break the bond between these 2 phosphates, I get the energy, fantastic. And now I have adenosine diphosphate because I only have 2 phosphates there, right? So, easy way to remember it is with ATP, pop off the 3rd phosphate group, get energy, right? Release this nice burst of energy that we use to power our cells, power our muscles, power, all of the movement that we do. And we use this energy from removing the 3rd phosphate group off of ATP to drive chemical reactions necessary for cellular functioning. So we use ATP to build our muscle tissue. We use ATP to repair a wound. We use ATP to grow roots if you're a plant, right? And so we're recycling this ATP. We're constantly taking off a phosphate from ATP, releasing the energy, using that energy in the rest of our cellular processes. and then coming back through and putting another phosphate on so that we have ATP ready to go. So ATP, break the bond, get energy. The result is ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and we add another phosphate and we're back to ATP. But I want to take a closer look at light energy because this is important. So light travels in both waves and particles. But we're going to think of light right now as a wave. And so light energy travels in waves, and plant pigments actually absorb specific wavelengths. So remember, light energy is a type of kinetic energy, and it's made up of these energy packets called photons. Remember, I was saying we have the sun and we have these photons of energy that are coming through. So light energy is made up of packets of energy called photons. And different photons carry different amounts of energy as these waves. And so the length of the wave determines the amount of energy the photon contains. So we actually, we've put it into a spectrum so we can understand it better. And this is called the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is just looking at those waves of energy. And so this range of energy is organized into different wavelengths and their characteristics. So the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. Okay, so let's look at this illustration. Here we're starting on the far end, and we've got these really short wavelengths. And remember, the wavelength is the length between the humps of the wave. And the shorter the wave, we have these gamma rays, very damaging, high energy, right? And then we have waves that are further apart, and these are called X-rays. And we use them, remember, in science, we always use everything that we know for the betterment of humanity. And we use X-rays so that we can actually see through the body, much like holding the body up to a very bright light. That's what an X-ray is, except the light is X-rays, right? And we capture that on a film, and we can see the bones, okay? But it's high energy, so it also can do damage, right? Next, when we look at the spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, we're looking at the wavelength. Now they're getting further apart, and now we have UV light. And we know that UV light can actually damage your eyes, right? It can damage your skin. We'll talk about how that happens later on when we get to that, how that damage happens. But this is still damaging, this wavelength of light. And then we have visible light. And that's anywhere from 740 nanometers to 400 nanometers in length, just to give you an idea of what the wavelength is. Versus when we're looking at gamma rays, this is like 1 nanometer. Super short wavelengths, high energy, causing a lot of damage. Now we'll continue on looking at the spectrum. So we have visible light. Now we get to infrared, which is here. And that's the same as when you're using your, say, TV remote. You have a little button that happens and you can see the infrared light. We can't see it with our eyes because our eyes can't see infrared. But if you were to take the TV remote and point it at your phone camera and take a picture, or even just turn on the video, when you press the button, your camera will actually be able to pick up the infrared light, which is really cool because so you can use that knowledge. So say you're in a hotel room and you want to know whether or not there are any spy cameras in the room that might be recording you while you're in there. Super easy, because your phone can actually pick up infrared light, is you just turn off the lights, you turn on the video portion of your phone, and you look around the room. And if there is an infrared beam that's coming from any camera, your phone, you'll be able to see it. So that's really cool way to use that knowledge. So you can make sure you're not being filmed when you're in a hotel room. Okay. Let's move on with the electromagnetic spectrum. Then we get to radio waves, which are extremely far apart. They are not damaging. They don't hurt us in any way. The really cool thing when you think about it, though, when you think about this electromagnetic spectrum, is the fact that these radio waves, these infrared waves, the UV light, X-rays, gamma rays, etc., radio waves can go through the walls, right? That's how you can turn on your radio when you're in the house, which is really cool. So the electromagnetic spectrum, super interesting, lots of uses of that knowledge, and the take home is that energy, light energy, is arranged based on the wavelength. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy, the more damage. So we've got this visible spectrum, right? I showed you here that we have visible light, and this is a spectrum. And this is the range of energy that humans can see as light. But not all animals see it in the same way that we do. Some animals can actually see in a different range of spectrum than we can. We can see, and this is an acronym that's used a lot, ROYGBIV. You can look it up to see what those colors are, right? And also in the visible spectrum, we have pigments, and so this is terminology. Pigments are molecules that absorb light, and this is really important when we get to plants. All right. So something to understand, that when this photon of light comes down from the sun, it can actually hit an electron, right, in an atom. And if it hits an electron, there's two potential fates of excited electrons. So electrons can return to their resting unexcited state after they get hit by this high energy photon, or excited electrons can be passed on to other atoms. So the passing of electrons in their excited state is a chief way that energy moves through cells. And so molecules that gain electrons through this excited state, an electron jumps over, right? Molecules that gain electrons always carry greater energy than before receiving them. So you have this molecule and it's sitting here, and suddenly a photon of light comes down, hits an electron of another atom, excites it, that electron jumps over to this atom, and now this atom has more energy than before that electron jumped, right? And so you can view this as passing of potential energy from molecule to molecule. All right, so cellular respiration converts food molecules into ATP, this universal source of energy for living organisms. And so how do living organisms fuel their actions? Through cellular respiration, right? The big picture. So let's take a look at the big picture of cellular respiration. Basically what's happening is both types of cells, right, animal cells and plant cells, are using cellular respiration. And so the inputs to cellular respiration are sugar and other energy-rich food molecules and oxygen. Put in sugar, you put in oxygen, the cells are going to perform cellular respiration. The outputs are going to be carbon dioxide, ATP, which is the whole reason why we are eating, right? So we can get to that ATP, and water. And so this is why we actually breathe, right? We breathe in to take in oxygen from the atmosphere so that we can do cellular respiration to get to the ATP that's in the chemical bonds of the foods we've eaten, and we breathe out the products, the byproducts of that cellular respiration, which is carbon dioxide. That's why we breathe out CO2, because it's the end product of cellular respiration. And then another end product is water, which is why we have to go to the bathroom and eliminate the water. If you never thought about that, like, where is that water coming from? Yes, you drink water because we need a lot of water, but the excess is actually eliminated, and we're actually creating extra water molecules from the end product of cellular respiration. Okay, so simple sort of card look at cellular respiration. The input is sugar and oxygen, and the output is carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, energy. So whenever you're thinking about cellular respiration, the easiest way to think about it and remember it is just remember what we do on a regular basis that you already know about. We breathe in oxygen, we take in oxygen, and we eat to get to that sugar molecule, to get to that chemical energy so that we can break it down, and the end product of that cellular respiration, which is the breakdown, is carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out, water, which is what we eliminate, and we're getting to that ATP, which is what we need for energy. So in this one slide, you have learned why we breathe, why we exhale, why we eat, and why we eliminate water. Okay. So, human example. Eat food, digest the food, absorb the nutrient molecules into the bloodstream, deliver the nutrient molecules to the cells, and basically the cells are forming and completing cellular respiration. So at this point, our cells can begin to extract some of the energy stored in the bonds of the food molecules. So we have to break it down to the base molecules. So the take-home message: living organisms extract energy through a process called cellular respiration, in which the high energy bonds of sugar, mostly glucose, and other energy-rich molecules are broken. And we'll talk about some of those other molecules, right? And when those molecules are broken, those bonds are broken, it's releasing the energy that went into creating them, right? When the plants did photosynthesis in order to create the bonds. Super, super cool. Okay, let's look deeper at cellular respiration. Let's look at what's happening with the glucose. So here, the first step in the process is called glycolysis. Now, every organism on the planet is performing glycolysis, from the bacteria, the prokaryotes, all the way up to us, our cells, performing glycolysis. And so what glycolysis is basically you're taking a glucose molecule and you have to use some energy in order to break the glucose molecule into pyruvate. Okay, break a bond, get energy, so we get out ATP. And we also get out a high energy molecule called NADH. So we've broken our glucose into 2-pyruvate, and what we got out of that process of breaking those bonds is ATP, NADH, and water. And that ATP is now used for further processes, right? And every organism that's alive on the planet performs glycolysis, from bacteria all the way up to us. Now, this is as far as bacteria can go. This is all the ATP they can get out, right? They can only perform glycolysis, breaking glucose into 2-pyruvate, getting ATP, NADH, and water, right? But we can go a step further, and we can actually put that pyruvate, those 2-pyruvate, into our mitochondria, and now we can start to wring out more ATP, right? And so here we're looking at what that process looks like. I don't really need you to remember, all of these coenzymes that are there, such as acetyl-CoA, etc. I really just want you to know what glycolysis is, number one, because that's important. Breaking glucose into 2-pyruvate and getting the ATP out, getting the energy out. The fact that we, as eukaryotes, go a step further to wring out even more energy, and we put those 2-pyruvate into our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. This is why it's called the powerhouse of the cell, because now the mitochondria are going to wring out even more ATP by using that pyruvate, putting it through the Krebs cycle. We're getting out CO2. That's where our CO2 that we breathe out is coming from. We're getting out ATP, right? We're getting water. And we're also getting, in our last step, even more ATP. So as you can see, this step of putting the 2-pyruvate, the products of glycolysis, into the mitochondria yields even more ATP, and that's really important, right? So what we can see is that each step in the breakdown of food increases the amount of available energy that's generated. So that was sort of the overview. Now we're just going to look at things just a little bit closer, right? So the first step of cellular respiration is glycolysis, the universal energy releasing pathway. It's called glycolysis is called the universal energy releasing pathway because everything from bacteria to plants to us to this fantastic little guy here is using glycolysis, and we're going a step further. But glycolysis is the universal pathway to release energy, ATP. 3 of the 10 steps yield energy, quickly harnessed to make ATP. The high energy electrons are transferred to NADH, and the net result is that each glucose molecule is broken down into 2 molecules of pyruvate. ATP is produced, and we also get this high energy NADH. Okay? Now the second step, which we can go through, which eukaryotes can go through in cellular respiration, is this Krebs cycle step inside of the process of cellular respiration, because we have mitochondria, right? And the mitochondria are where this Krebs cycle is happening, and the Krebs cycle is just wringing out more ATP. That's its goal. That's the whole reason for being. All right, and this is a more detailed look at the Krebs cycle. Now, if you go further in biology or science, then at some point you're going to have to memorize all the steps in the Krebs cycle, right? I don't need you to memorize all the steps in the Krebs cycle. I just need you to know that the Krebs cycle is actually happening inside the mitochondria, and what it's doing is giving us more ATP. This is where our carbon dioxide is actually being released as a byproduct. This is why we exhale, right? And the whole goal is to get more ATP, okay? So 2 turns of the Krebs cycle are necessary to completely dismantle our original molecule of glucose into our pyruvate and to wring out more and more. So the payoff from the Krebs cycle, ATP, NADH, and FADH2. These are our high energy molecules. So we're just wringing out more energy. So take home message. A huge amount of additional energy can be harvested by cells after glycolysis. First, the end product of glycolysis, pyruvate, is chemically modified. And then in the Krebs cycle, the modified pyruvate is broken down step by step to get more ATP, to get more energy. Now, we're going to take just a closer look at this third step in cellular respiration, how ATP is actually built, right? Because I've kind of did this hand wavy thing and we get ATP magically, right? But there is no magic, right? This is all just chemical bonds, right? This is all just chemistry, which is really cool when you think about it, how our cells are doing all of this machinery and this chemistry without us having to think about it, right? But now let's look at how ATP is built. And ATP is actually built in the electron transport chain. So all of this is happening thanks to the mitochondria. So two key features of mitochondria are essential to their ability to harness energy from molecules. Feature number one is the mitochondria have this bag within a bag structure, and we'll see when I get to the image on the next slide. And feature number two, electron carriers are organized within the inner bag. So a little bit more detail than I need you to remember, but just to kind of help you understand what's happening. So let's take a look at the structure of mitochondria and what makes them so special, okay? So here we have a look at the mitochondria, and we can see that they are this bag within a bag, right? Here we have the outer membrane of the mitochondria, and then we have this folded inner membrane, which is like another bag inside this outer bag, okay? So we've got this inner membrane space, which is here between the outer bag and the inner bag. And then we have the mitochondrial matrix. So this is just terminology. And so this inner bag is studded with these molecules, and these molecules create an electron transport chain that enables the ATP production. So this is where ATP is actually being produced, in this inner bag of the mitochondria. Okay. We'll talk a little bit briefly about proton gradients and potential energy. So we've got this flow of hydrogen ions is actually what's fueling the attachment of the free-floating phosphate groups to ADP to produce ATP. Because remember, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, right? When I break off that one phosphate, now I'm left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And I can put this other phosphate back on, but I need the flow of hydrogen ions in order to reattach this third phosphate, okay? So we can take a look closer at that. I don't want you to get too caught up in what's happening in this electron transport chain. I just want you to know that there is something called the electron transport chain, and basically what's happening is the hydrogen is getting put through these pumps, and this energy of putting it through the pump is helping to put the phosphate back onto the ADP. Okay, but I don't want you to try to dive too deep into the details of the electron transport chain. You can if you choose to, but you don't have to. I just need you to know that ADP is being turned into ATP inside the inner bag of the mitochondria. Okay, that's where the electron transport chain lives, and that's where ADP is getting its third phosphate. That's really all the depth that I need you to know for that. Okay, so now when we look at this graphic, we can understand what we're looking at a little bit better, right? So here we're starting at the top with glycolysis. Let's say we ate a nice salad, right, or some spinach, and we now have the glucose from that. We break the glucose in glycolysis down into 2-pyruvate. We get some ATP out. Fantastic. But we need more, all right? So we send those 2-pyruvate into the mitochondria. And then in the mitochondria, the pyruvate is broken down further. It's sent into the Krebs cycle. We get out more ATP. We get some carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. We send it through the electron transport chain, which is studied along the inner bag of the mitochondria. And we're putting on our last phosphate to get more ATP. And this is where our oxygen is needed. So remember, we're breathing in oxygen. This is why we breathe. And I kind of left you sort of hand wavy with that. But this is why we're breathing in oxygen, because oxygen has to go into this electron transport chain in order to get out that last ATP. Okay, that last molecule of ATP that we need. Sorry, I keep moving this chair. Okay. And so just to kind of clarify, taking a step back to clarify where the processes are happening. So glycolysis is happening in the cytoplasm of the cell. And this further step of cellular respiration is happening in the mitochondria. Okay? But there are alternative pathways to energy acquisition. Remember I said that before? We're going to look at what some of those are. So beer, wine, and spirits are actually byproducts of cellular metabolism in the absence of oxygen. Remember, we breathe in oxygen, and that's called aerobic. And when we breathe in oxygen, we need that for the electron transport chain, right? So we can get ATP. But what if there is no oxygen, right? Cellular metabolism can still go on, depending on the organism, for a short period of time, or some organisms can go completely anaerobic without oxygen for a longer period of time, right? So when would that happen, that we would be without oxygen? Well, for example, when we're swimming, right? So during strenuous exercise, our muscles can require more oxygen than is available to them, right? You take a deep breath, you're swimming along, right? Your muscles are still burning ATP. It's burning ATP. They still need energy in order to keep you swimming. So we're going to take a look at how we accomplish that. So here, when we have oxygen present, right, for our cells, then we can go ahead and use cellular respiration, and the end product is going to be ATP and water, right? Because our electron acceptor in the electron transport chain is oxygen. But when there is no oxygen, then we can actually use pyruvate. But when we use pyruvate, which means we can't use this step, we have to just use the pyruvate step, our end product is going to be lactic acid. And we know this, right? Because when you're swimming, or say you're running, most people know it from running, and you're running, or even exercising, right? You're in the gym, you're lifting weights, right? If you lift too much, too long, you're going to get this buildup of lactic acid, because now your muscles are burning pyruvate instead of using oxygen, because you just can't breathe in enough oxygen to keep up with the burn, right? And this lactic acid actually burns, which is why your muscles are very sore. They start to hurt, they start to burn, because lactic acid is being produced, right? That is nature's way of saying you've done enough. Time to stop, take a break, let the cells catch up with their oxygen need so that we can basically get back to basic cellular aerobic cellular respiration and not be in this anaerobic state, which we can only do as humans for a short period of time, right? But there are other organisms that is what they do. They can function very well in an anaerobic state without oxygen, right? Take a look at yeast. So their electron acceptor is acetaldehyde, and the end product for them is ethanol. And we actually use that knowledge, right? Because when we put yeast with sugar, say we take some grapes, we smash them up, right? We're breaking bonds. So we can get down to the glucose. We put our yeast in. They're going to use that. Their electron acceptor, once we cut off the oxygen, is now going to be acetaldehyde. Our end product is going to be ethanol, and we call that wine. If we were to do the same thing with some grains, right? You take a mash of different grains like barley. What else is used? I'm not really good at my beer making. I can only think of barley, but there's other grains that are used to make beer. We cook the grains so that we can release the sugars that are in the grains. Then we put in the yeast and basically, put them in the fermentation tanks, right? Shut off the oxygen, and then we get ethanol, and we call that beer, right? So we use the fact that different organisms actually can perform their cellular respiration anaerobically without oxygen, and our end product is going to be ethanol. We, when we're functioning normally, use oxygen as our electron acceptor inside the electron transport chain, inside the mitochondria, during our cellular respiration to get to our ATP. That's how we normally function. That's why we breathe in oxygen. But we can function for a short amount of time anaerobically, but our end product is going to be lactic acid because our electron acceptor is now pyruvate, and that lactic acid causes the burn. And when you feel the burn, that means you have gone anaerobically long enough and you need to stop, you need to rest, you need to catch up with your oxygen content, right? That's in the blood for the cells to actually be able to do their normal cellular respiration. So exertion without enough oxygen leads to burning cramps in animals and us, but in yeast, it leads to alcohol. Okay. And so here is just a look at the different fermentation tanks, and there's different strains of yeast that are used to produce different forms of alcohol that we're used to consuming, right? So there's certain strains that will give certain flavors to different wines. Usually those strains of yeast are found on the grapes themselves, that you don't have to actually go and buy a certain type of yeast. If you're going to make wine, those yeast that make the wine are on the grapes. But when it comes to beer, you do have to go and purchase the yeast for the type of beer that you want to make, and because they impart different flavors, right? And so it's very much an art to that. But you're going to be learning in one of your labs how these fermentation tanks, these bioreactors, actually work. Really cool. All right, so we're almost done. Oxygen deficiency limits the breakdown of fuel because the electron transport chain requires oxygen as the final acceptor of electrons generated during glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. We get more ATP when we use our electron transport chain, and it's all about the ATP. But if we are eating a complete diet, then cells can actually run on protein and fat as well as glucose, because we don't just eat things that have glucose in it, right? We eat steak and And, we have butter and things like that. If you've ever wondered, well, why do we eat these things, right? So we know we eat plants because we're trying to get to the glucose, but let's look at where these other products, how we're breaking them down. So when we look at fats, here's what's happening. The fats are broken into fatty acids and glycerol because that's what fats are made of. The glycerol is actually going into glycolysis, so it's being broken into the pyruvates, right? And the fatty acids are coming down into this acetyl-CoA production to go into the Krebs cycle, okay? So that's how we're using fats to actually get to our energy. Carbohydrates, basically that's what we walk through. Carbohydrates are sugars. So we already walked through that, going through glycolysis and the acetyl-CoA, Krebs cycle, energy, ATP. But let's look at proteins. What happens when we break proteins down? So remember, proteins have their carbon-based compounds, their amino acids. And so basically what's happening is we're breaking them into, the amino groups are going here for the production of tissue, or if we take in too much, it's excreted as waste. But we can use the amino groups to form other proteins that we need, right? But the carbon compounds that are also in proteins are going into glycolysis. Some of them are going into glycolysis to be broken into pyruvates, and then some of them are going into the Krebs cycle step. And so in this way, this is what allows us to survive on a greater diversity of food sources. Because when you think about it, if you have an organism that can only eat one type of food source, right? What if something happens to that food source? It's gone. Well, if they can only eat that one type of food source, that organism is going to be gone, right? But if you have an organism that can eat this diversity of food sources, well, now if one source of food is gone, well, that's okay because the organism can eat other types of food sources. And so this is a very beneficial adaptation that we have to be able to eat this diversity of food products in order to obtain the ATP, the energy that we need. So, take-home message, last slide. Humans and other organisms have metabolic machinery that allows them to extract energy and other valuable chemicals from proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, in addition to simple sugars such as glucose. All right, so now you know why we breathe, why we exhale, why we excrete urine, and how we actually get the energy to function and move and do all the things that we do. And it's all because of this molecule that we create through cellular respiration. The molecule is ATP. Bye, everybody.